segment now, chapter 5. Okay, so there's some important language here, and the whole idea gets back to the idea that economics tries to help societies or communities organize and allocate scarce resources in the most efficient way. And here are the theories for doing that. And so we'll talk about the idea of surplus, and you'll have a consumer surplus, which amounts to measuring the degree to which, at the equilibrium price, consumers and suppliers too are getting a price better than some of them would have been willing to operate with. And so we actually measure that that benefit for consumers and the surplus for producers, or the advantage that they would get at the equilibrium price, and find out that this surplus that we're measuring is at its peak at the equilibrium. So it's just more support for the idea of the equilibrium price and how it provides benefits to the most participants. Okay. It's supposed to be scarce resources, by the way. And it's important to understand that a command economy is another word for an economy where resources are allocated by a central authority, like a dictator or a communist rule or collectivist rule, where the government or some central authority decides how much we're going to produce and how we're going to allocate all our resources. Majority rule, okay, so people would vote. Market price, which is for goods that have a price, that aren't, that have markets. The price mechanism implies free markets. And then contests, holding contests and lotteries and things, of course, wouldn't be necessarily fair. So we're interested in fairness and efficiency at the same time, and trying to look at some of these different methods. First come, first serve, like they do with concert tickets. Okay. And by force. So this is kind of a rigged game, because obviously a lot of these are flawed, but we do use these methods at times. I have a guy who works on my car, and you show up, and the first people there in the morning get served first. Personal characteristics, yeah, sometimes people win the contest because of some attributes they have. Their quiz shows or beauty contests or athletic events, who knows. So all right, so the market price system lets price decide who gets what, right? And for most of us who are not self-employed, we sell our labor and use the money we get from that to buy the things we need. The command is, I don't know if I agree with that last statement. There are phases in an economy's or a society's growth where a command system is actually more efficient. Like China, for example, Communist Party, but only in a command system could they have built up their infrastructure as rapidly as they did and pay for it the way they did. After you get those decisions made, the command system begins to break down for other reasons that are beyond the scope of this course. But I'm just pointing out that a lot of these slides represent the whole book promotes the free market system, and it does have flaws. But I also think that a lot of these books are going to be rewritten in about 10 years. Majority rule, okay. We vote on things. Okay, I think we know what these are. Okay. So these are unique situations, and they give you examples of when they actually make some sense. Yeah, I mean, personal characteristics. In a way, it's that TV show, The Bachelor, right? Okay. Well, I mean, let's face facts. There are whole countries run by warlords in various cities in America at different times. We had gangs or mobs running the city under beneath the surface. All right, and so value is what we get, price is what we pay. Value is subjective, though. In other words, the person decides how much value they're getting it. So, the maximum price a person is willing to pay is the value, and the willingness to pay determines demand. So, we're going to show how, and don't forget the rule of thumb: a demand curve is a benefit curve. And it also, I think I should use this language. It's a marginal benefit curve because the next one, the price for the 14th one doesn't mean that I would buy all of mine at that price. So there's a difference. And if I've misrepresented that in the past, this would be a good time to fix it. That 14th item that I'll pay less for, the implication is not necessarily that I bought all of them at that price, but that would be the total demand. And usually those curves are not made up of one person's preference, but of the whole market preferences. So it's a little confusing. I prefer to just say demand curve is a benefit curve. Okay. And we're explaining this a little bit now. The difference between the price of a good and the quantity demanded by one person is called individual demand versus market demand, the collective decision. And so we'll get a little more clarity on that. Yeah. So here what they're saying is that we have a market made up of Lisa and Nick, and they're the only two people in the market. But collectively, they do make up the market. And so we can draw a demand curve based on what we know about their preferences. And so all you have to do is add up the amounts at the different prices. And so at that price, $1, Nick and Lisa are willing to consume 40 slices a month. And if you went through that process for each of those price points, you'd get that curve on the right. And so that's an aggregate of the demands or preferences of the individual people within the market. And it kind of goes to what I'm saying. Even though Lisa was willing to buy some at as high as 250, or actually zero, but some as high as $2, right? We'll find out what the aggregate, what the market price would be. And so the consumer surplus represents the fact that even though in this example, Lisa was willing to buy some pizza at $2 a slice, if the market price were lower than that, she would recognize a certain amount of benefit because she was willing to buy some at $2. And so we add up those collective differences between what they were willing to pay, or the value that they saw, versus the market price, and that is consumer surplus. And I think we'll have a graphic representation of that. So if the market price is $1, you can see that both Nick and Lisa had been willing to buy some at $1.50 and $2. And so the fact that the market price is $1 means that they're actually happy, or they sense value by being able to buy 40 slices between them at $1, because they were willing to buy 10 collectively at $2 and 20 collectively at $1.50. And so maybe we'll get a chance to see what this looks like. Yeah, Lisa's surplus from the 10 slice. Notice there's $1 difference between what she was willing to pay for the 10th slice and what she actually paid, $1. So 2 minus 1 is $1. Okay. And so what we actually wind up doing is taking, if you want the formula or the process for this, the total consumer surplus is underneath the demand curve above the price. It's that simple. Notice how that triangle for Lisa is above $1 and below the demand curve. Everything within that region represents the value. And you can even think of it mathematically. It would be a rectangle. It would be 1/2 of a rectangle. So 30 slices, and well, I don't like the fact that they have 250 on there but 0 slices. But if we're going to shade it all in, then we'll do this anyway. 150 times 30 is 45 divided by 2. So we can actually figure out the dollar value of that value of the surplus when the price is $1. And so Nick, see what they say about him. So he has less surplus, but collectively, and you could actually go through the process of figuring out the value of those two triangles, and they would add up to the area under the demand curve above $1 in the far right graph. So I'm going to draw here because this is the shortcut way. It has to be above the demand curve at $1 and below, or excuse me, above the price, the market price, and below the demand curve. Okay. So, we would figure out what this area is, and it amounts to, well, you'd have to figure it out with triangles and boxes probably. But anyway, they'd be the same. The little triangle for Nick and the larger one for Lisa would add up to that. So total surplus is, whatever that adds up to, the area of those two triangles, and you can figure out what it is. I don't think you're ever asked to actually calculate it, but they do want to know that you can calculate the surplus based on the graph and the market price, and it's just the difference. If it's the 10th one, then it's just $1 for Lisa and For Nick, it's 0. And by the way, it is helpful to know that these parts of the demand curve never enter the market. So if there was one person, in addition to Lisa and Nick, who was willing to buy some at 50 cents, they would never participate because the price is too high. And that's it. That does show up in one of the questions where they asked you who has the least surplus, and you don't count the person below the market price because they don't play. Kind of a trick question. Okay. And I'm going to clear those things and move on. Okay. Yeah. So they're trying to make a difference or distinction between cost and price. And cost is what the producer gives up, price is what the producer receives. I don't remember language like that on any of the homework. The cost of one more unit is its marginal cost. You can compare that to the idea of marginal benefit. But this idea of marginal cost is very important because if I've already paid for the salaries and I've got my place open, I paid the rent and the utilities, and I want to sell one more ice cream cone, I should be willing to sell it for the cost of the ice cream and a cup or a napkin or whatever else I have to put on there. But I definitely shouldn't sell it for more than that, for less than that. And so firms will sell right up to their marginal cost. The last item should pay for itself, because you wouldn't produce one, because marginal cost is almost always rising, almost always, on the short term. And as a result, if the last unit was break even, then the next unit would more likely be a loss. Hello? Hello? Oops. I'm going to have to pause this, I think. Hello? Having some trouble with my audio. Hello? Give me 1 second. Okay. I just have to pause for a second. Hold on. And let's see. Okay. Let's try it again. I'm hoping this works. Okay. So if I'm hoping that I came back on. It looks like it. And let me just make sure I'm recording. Yeah, we are recording. Okay. All right. So a cost curve is a supply curve is a marginal cost curve. The cost of one more unit is marginal cost. Very important ideas. And I'm going to have to advance it a little bit to get back where I was, but that's okay. I'm going to try to get this down to 45 minutes. I don't think this chapter is as long as the number 3. Okay, we're getting close now. All right, hope that didn't make anybody dizzy. All right, consumer surplus. Below the demand curve, above the price line. That shaded area, and you can calculate that value by taking the width times height divided by 2, or in the case of the unusual shape on the right, you'd have to break it into squares and rectangles, or triangles and rectangles. And so Lisa, what am I doing here? All right, so oh, this is brutal. So cost and price. All right, we've talked about that. The supply curve is a cost curve. And so the same thing happens here. These people now are pizza makers, and they have their cost schedules, and they would collectively create a cost schedule for the market in this small place. Okay. And so we go through the same process and decide. Let's go back. Notice that the supply curve for the two of them together as one market, or in one market, would look like that graph on the right. And it's important, it's helpful to do this because it shows you how markets are made up of individual firms' cost curves, and at some prices, certain of the producers will not participate. That's an important idea. And so producer surplus is going to be the excess of the amount received from the sale of a good over the cost of producing it. And because we know that the supply curve is a cost curve, then anything under the supply curve anything above the cost curve below the price represents producer surplus. And so let's go back to what we learned on the slide. Cost versus price. Price is what they receive, cost is what they pay, producers now. And so anything above the cost curve to the price level is the producer surplus. And we do it the same way we did consumer surplus, except now, instead of the area below the demand curve above the price line, we take the area above the cost curve below the price line. And so the producer surplus, it just represents how much more they got than they were willing to take for some of the pizzas. That should make sense. If I was willing to sell some at 10, I derive benefit from the fact that I sold, some at 15, quite a few actually. I don't want to say benefit because I'll confuse you, but I derive value, or I don't want to call it profit yet either, but I was willing to sell some at that lower price, and I got The market price was above that, so that represents value to me. So surplus, the whole point of surplus, and you can look at these blue triangles now and see that they are indeed above the cost curve or the supply curve, below the market price line, and that the one on the right represents the aggregate benefit, those two, or value, I should say, that those two producers received when the market price was $15. And you could figure out how much money that represented. The whole purpose of this is to show how the equilibrium level produces the most surplus for everyone, consumers and producers. And what they're doing is figuring out the costs of production by taking the quantity produced and the area under the cost curve. And that would, in fact, represent the total cost. I mean, you can see that the rectangle that's made up of both the blue triangles, blue shapes, and the pink shapes is the total revenue, $15 a pizza times 150 pizzas. And you can see that the cost is made up of the area underneath the supply curve because it is a cost curve. And so you get a sense of the value, that's the best word, sold in excess of the cost of producing it. So when we put them together and have a supply and a demand curve, we wind up getting, let me see, what do they want you to do here? When production is, okay, and so they want you to understand these terms that I don't think they've defined yet. And they want to talk about the efficiency in a couple of ways. They're talking about MSB and MSC. Well, that stands for marginal social benefit and marginal social cost. And if you know that the demand curve is a benefit curve and that the cost curve, the supply curve, is a cost curve, then you should be able to see that at that quantity, marginal social benefit, the demand, exceeds marginal social cost. Okay. So there are some questions about this, and you should be able to determine which line would be higher on either side of the equilibrium quantity. So there are a couple questions about that. Just go back to, you're going to have to interpret or translate this MSB, marginal social benefit, marginal social cost. Well, just recognize that on the right of the equilibrium quantity, or 10 in this case, 10,000 pizzas, to the right of that, costs are above benefits, and the reverse is true on the left side. So this is about efficiency. At the equilibrium point, in the efficient quantity, resources are efficiently used. When marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost, the market is efficient. Okay. But we also know that because consumer surplus and producer surplus, and you can see how they're just slightly different colors, and the consumer is above the price line, below the demand curve. The producer is above the supply curve, below the price line. And that triangle is as big as it's going to get at the equilibrium. Anything else that happens will make it smaller. And as I pointed out in class the first night, one of the ironies of the invisible hand and Adam Smith's capitalism, which, by the way, is going to go some changes in the next decade. You can remember that I said that. A lot of these ideas that our textbook uses and our authors learned when they were in college are 50 and 60 years old, and economics is a relatively young science. It's less than, well, it's a couple hundred years old. I mean, as a science, I mean, people have organized markets for centuries and millennia even, but to have it as a science and a discipline, it's relatively young, and there are a lot things. There are a lot of things that economists have wrong right now. I don't like this rah rah stuff when we have examples of how just blatant greed and very callous ethics and remorseless behaviors by um, any number of members of this so-called free market system, and there are a lot of market failures within it, and I don't think those get as much attention. That's not to say that it can't be adjusted, or there aren't some other flaws in our system that contribute to it. But personally, as I watch, and I've been watching for a long time, I think we're about to see some disruption in the notions of economics. And so, I teaching the class, I can teach you the theory, but I'm just telling you that be prepared to watch it change, and hopefully for the better. Okay, so the irony was that people were working together, letting price help allocate these scarce resources, but they weren't doing it out of any altruism. In other words, it wasn't uh, out of the generosity of their hearts. They pursue their own self-interest, as it says in the second sentence, and yet through that mechanism, with the help of price, they did manage to most efficiently allocate the resources in that society. Um, if you can call, 10% of the people owning 70% of the wealth efficient, as it is today, if you can call that efficient, okay. But my point is, um, it is a very efficient system up to a point. Market failures is the term we use to describe when the market doesn't deliver efficiently. And so we can make too much of something, too little of another thing. And usually something that we make too much of, we make too much of it because it's not properly priced, or individuals derive one level of benefit. But when everybody does the same thing as an individual, we wind up having too much of something. And I mean things like things that pollute, or things that use valuable resources and so forth. So we don't consider the effect of everybody doing it, and it's only the individual value that goes into the free market system, and that's what generates what are called externalities or market failures. And things like education, which is deemed to be a positive thing, we often value it based on the benefit we derive, or we believe we will derive, from an education. But if everyone in society gets an education, everyone benefits. The society works more efficiently. And so we undervalue it collectively because we're only valuing it based on what it does for us. We don't consider what happens if everybody is educated and how it makes our society function better. So those are examples of externalities. They can be positive or they can be negative. They talk about situations, and here the graph starts to get we're trying to build on some of these ideas. And they said, if this is the efficient quantity, the pink or magenta dot, but if they restrict production to 5,000 pizzas a day, all this surplus will be lost, because at $10,015 a pizza, we had all this extra benefit in here in this triangle. But once we put a quota or a limit on this, we don't produce as much as society would like. And so the inefficiency or the loss of surplus is called a deadweight loss. And we can use that triangle to describe it or even calculate it. And it's a social loss. It involves in this case, half of it is the loss of consumers who would have purchased more, and the suppliers who would have supplied more. Yeah, and if they produce too much, people wouldn't be willing to, well, let's see more specifically what we're talking about here. If production is expanded, then what they're saying is somebody is paying for these extra. Let me go back. Oh, I can't go back. Oh, I'll go back. All right, so I wanted to draw on this because it's a good thing to draw about. So normally we'd have all this at $10,000 and $15, we'd have all that surplus. But now, by producing that extra 5,000 pizzas, the idea is that they're producing pizzas at that price, and consumers don't want to buy them. So somebody's got to subsidize. Someone has to subsidize the production of those pizzas to produce those other 5, because the consumers don't want that many. They don't want to pay that much for the extra 5,000. So the government would be subsidizing that. That's the idea. But the point is, it's inefficient. We lose some of the surplus that we would have had. So very often the government steps in, and for whatever reason, and tariffs, by the way, fit in this category, price and quantity regulations, taxes and subsidies, externalities, public goods, and common resources. We'll get into these. I didn't see a lot of questions on this, though. There are, for example, in New York, rent controls, or in the labor markets, which are factor markets, if you remember, they have minimum wages now that are coming into play. And so these things will disrupt the efficient markets, and the reasoning must be that there is some other issue that the regulators and the decision makers believe is important enough to do that. So price and quantity, price regulations are tariffs, taxes. Quantity regulations are quotas very often. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we use taxes most often to create incentives or to try to correct externalities and market failures. Subsidies also try to correct market failures by putting more of something out into society, by lowering the price so people will consume more, like flu shots or education or home purchases, taking out, we subsidize mortgages by letting people write off the interest, or solar power. At one time, we used some taxes to do it, but there are a lot of subsidies. We subsidize some of our oil explorers to provide new sources of energy and so forth. Yeah, and an externality is when it's similar. I use the term to cover, well, an externality is like an unintended consequence. Like, um, if everybody uses a combustion engine and drives alone in their car, um, it can pollute the air or wear out the roads or cause traffic congestion. Those would all be examples of externalities. We only think of the benefit we derive against the cost. But if everyone does it, then we have a social cost that comes into play that we don't think about, most of us, when we make those decisions to consume gas, or some people, it used to be cigarettes, and things like this. So um, externalities are usually negative, or I shouldn't say negative, because they can be positive, like education, as I mentioned. Um, and Externalities are market failures that usually come into play when we don't consider the collective cost or benefit of a good or service in our society. Public goods, here is where there are things that we use that are free, like parks and rivers and air and water, in lakes and rivers, and and television signals and national defense. Even though we pay taxes, there are people who don't pay taxes who benefit from national defense or from public transportation, or from local police and fire departments. Everyone benefits, but not everyone pays the same amount. And so a public good, for example, a park or a lake, um, a free resource that everyone gets to use. And because some people use it more than others, the government controls the access and the cost and things. So there is no price. And as a result, we don't get the proper usage. A common resource, a public good, is free and it's unlimited. In other words, my use of it doesn't limit your use of it. Like, um, theoretically, I would say a public road, except during rush hour, my choosing to drive makes it more congested. But listening to FM radio, or um, swimming in the ocean, or national defense. And so common resource, however, is a resource that we share, but it's finite. My use of it could limit someone else's ability to use it later. And so the classic example was the tragedy of the commons, and it goes back to England and an imaginary or real village of sheep herders, and they overgrazed the grass that was within the village boundaries, and they had to figure out, because it was free. And so eventually the herds grew, and sooner or later the flocks grew, and sooner or later they had eaten up all the grass. And so the idea was, how could they have worked out a system to make sure that didn't happen? And we're seeing it today. Fish in the ocean get overfished, or um, the air and the waterways got polluted very badly, especially into the 70s, because there was no rule or cost associated with dumping and things like that. So externalities are usually uh, the attempt is made to fix them using taxes or subsidies. I didn't think we'd get into monopolies, but a monopoly is the sole provider of a good or service. And I didn't see anything in the assignment on monopolies. Monopolies, let's, yeah, I'm going to skip that because I didn't see any questions in the homework. But I do want to talk about alternatives. Majority rule. Okay, so fairness can be divided. There are two ideas. The result should be fair, or the rules should be fair. Yeah, these are the three in utilitarianism, and you'll hear some of these with politics coming up. Utilitarianism is the idea that we should try to find out how to make the most people the happiest, or the greatest happiest for the greatest number. And the idea there is that if someone has $10 million, they're not going to, $1,000 won't change their life. They won't derive a lot of benefit. We know that from the idea of the incremental or marginal consumption of more money is probably no different than any other good or service. And so the idea is a poor person would derive a tremendous amount more benefit from 1,000 than a rich person would. And so utilitarianism says that you should do that up to a point. There is a point when you create a disincentive for people to create businesses and be entrepreneurs and so forth. So it's more complex than just taking from the rich and giving it to the poor. But the idea is that the poorer person derives more benefit from a given amount of money than the richer person does, up to a point. Okay. And redistribution is an important word, and there's a lot of talk about it in the upcoming campaign. We'll see what happens with that, though. Okay, and so the idea is there comes a point when, I've never seen it represented that way, but John Rawls was the relatively modern philosopher who came up with this idea. And he really is talking about income should be redistributed to the point at which the poorest person is as well off as possible. Well, what does that mean? The trade-off is between efficiency and fairness. Capitalism is efficient, but it doesn't distribute wealth evenly, and that's a fact. That's not just me. So the symmetry principle, this is relatively new. People in similar situations should be treated similar. Now here, the rules have to be fair. And so this is probably libertarianism, which is the idea that the playing field should be level. Private property is very important, and laws to protect people's rights to own property are one of the foundation stones of capitalism and free market systems. Okay, so that's it for this one. It was kind of unusual the way they jumped around at the end, but I'll be around this week, and I would expect that you'll have questions. So maybe if I hear from you, maybe we'll have a Zoom session. Okay.